So, hello everyone. I'm very happy to see all of you here. Um, Thank you very much, Suresh, for the invitation, and thanks to KREA for hosting this event. It is a pleasure to be here with you in India, especially for many reasons, and I will elaborate on one of these reasons in detail at the end of the talk. What is the topic of our gathering today? Culture-based development as a paradigm shift. Culture-based development is a paradigm that I have been designing for the last over 15 years. And it is a paradigm shift, and it's worth noting, not just because it's my baby that I love very much, but because it creates indeed a new step in the way that modeling of economic choice can be made based on the use of this paradigm. Um, Therefore, it first of all is a paradigm shift in theory, in economic modeling theory, but it offers new pockets of understanding how people make their decisions and how their behavior is influenced by culture. So therefore, there are new insights for policymakers as well, especially regional policymakers interested in using culture as one of the fields in which they can invest and succeed in ameliorating the milieu and creating the necessary cultural environment, cultural capital for generating socioeconomic flourishing, improving the cooperation between people, and creating a multiplier effect through culture for socioeconomic flourishing. And why is it notable paradigm shift? Because culture has been a very problematic animal since the very dawn of economics. The first economists, as you all know, were calling themselves moral philosophers because intuitively and instinctively everybody understands that while we make our economic choices, we never stop reasoning also in the same time as moral beings. And the morality of these choices sometimes is high morality, which every human around the world will agree about. You cannot take a decision just because it benefits you if it hurts your mother or if it hurts, an entity which every human being will understand um, should be regarded morally. Um, but in the same time, culture is the source of many bizarre behaviors, if you consider them from a rational point of view. Um, Things which are perfectly rationally acceptable, such as pork steak, should be equally nutritious rationally for every human being. But there are many different religions that, and therefore cultures, that relate to this very elementary and basic rationally useful item in completely polarized manner. So if you take a person from Catholic Germany, they will be exalted by this pork steak. And if you take a Jewish or a Muslim person, or for that matter, a Jain, they will be terrified from the idea to eat pork steak. So this is certainly a cultural influence on choice. And between the spectrum of harming your mother's well-being and eating pork steak, there is a plethora of choices, each of which has a cultural bias on the rational choice. So handling and understanding how to model the presence of this component of choice is crucial because it creates a deviation from the rational choice. People are not just choosing something that rationally has some kind of outcome. They definitely factor in also this cultural element. But it is not a question of boundedness because and the Jews and the Muslims and the Jain understand that the pork has nutritious value, right? It's not a question of cognition. They're not cognitively biased. They very rationally make a choice to factor in the cultural weighting of their choices. So there is room for understanding the cultural behavior using the rational main modeling tools of economics, and this hasn't been exactly done. So there was a big backlash from moral philosophy. There was the period of culture-free economics when they tried to model behavior as if culture didn't exist, mostly because it was very difficult to model culture. And then gradually in the 90s, some people started turning back to the understanding that, oh, culture matters. With the development of econometrics, it started being possible to provide more and more empirical evidence for this. And nowadays, most modern economists would agree that culture matters. Some have tried to make modeling that shows, given that culture is element of choice, what will follow. So this would be the Gary Becker's taste for discrimination, for instance. He will tell you that if people hate with a particular, have a certain yeah, taste for discrimination, which is a hate attitude towards a certain group, this will create a certain amount of inefficiency in the system, and then how the system will operate and essentially efface this hate. Problem is, the disappearance of hate never happens, right? So there is something very important around how culture emerges and where it comes from. So until we understand the economics of the emergence of culture, we do not really model the whole process of how culture factors in our choices and the outcomes of them. We know that it will cause something, but we have no idea how to tackle. And the other aspect of the whole story is that many cultural products have been modeled. Institutions matter and social capital matters, but institutions guard certain ways of thinking, so they are derivatives of culture. um, Cooperation, whom you cooperate with and whom you do not cooperate with, definitely is based on whether culturally you perceive it compatible to cooperate with this person or not, morally and so on. So, while we know a lot about the fact that culture matters and how it and its derivatives matter, the economics of today has big holes in terms of understanding what culture is, in terms of how it emerges, and how to exactly measure the presence of this component in the choice. And this is exactly where culture-based development steps in. It is a paradigm that fills in this gap. It puts culture in the beginning of the causal change of choice, defining culture as the meta strategy of a combination of attitudes, amalgam of attitudes, that rank every possible item of reality in terms of how good and how bad it is. Okay, it's a strategy for survival, which is inherited from the past but adapted currently according to the endogenous situation of the decision maker. And this code becomes translated then into an order of preferences. And there is whole microeconomic explanation of this market for values, for the separate attitudes, how it aggregates, and then how its power to influence choice can be precisely measured in terms of the cultural variation, which is a variation of a complex dynamic entity, right? Many, many attitudes, so it has to be handled in a specific way. I have spent, as I told you, over 15 years figuring out how this complex dynamic entity should be handled. And today, what I will show you is a presentation about the book Culture-Based Development, published by Edward Elgar, which sums up the main principles that culture-based development has elaborated over the years. This is the 11th event. There was the so-called Caravan of Knowledge of Culture-Based Development. It went many places from Green College in Canada to Athens, and meanwhile passed through very faraway places as Aberystwyth here in Wales, very central places such as Manchester, such as the Brussels or Luxembourg, um, including the European Commission, where also Suresh was at one of the conferences. And the idea is to spread the news about this paradigm, because objectively it does an improvement in the modeling of economic choice, but it has to be spread and disseminated so that it starts being practiced with further understanding. If you're interested in the different presentations, you can go at the YouTube channel where there are recordings. The recording from this event will also go there. At every venue, I have been adapting it to the audience that I have been speaking to, because in Green College, the people that I was speaking to were people who were social psychologists. Then in Athens, there were regional economists, right? So there is quite a diapason of people. There was a presentation also in front of cultural economists. So there I would delve more into how culture can be used as a tool for policymakers. And there were also policymakers who were speaking about that from Netherlands. So there are many aspects, because culture-based development itself is a multidisciplinary concept. When I started understanding what culture is, how it has to be defined, and which are the channels through which it influences the human choice, I didn't do this in the usual kind of arrogant economic way of just sitting in my room and thinking about it. I did that part as well, but I realized that it will be way better to be humble about trying to learn what other people thought. So it's a very multidisciplinary paradigm which has found a lot of wisdom in sociological, psychological literature, and then has translated whatever valuable pieces I found there in the proper language of economics. Many economists do read social sciences, but they try to directly take from there some kind of a term and plug it. Instead of this, I'm seeing what they're explaining as an idea, but then translating it into the standard understanding of supply and demand, of markets. So, in other words, I'm making something similar to a public choice approach to couch. So, public choice brought the economic methodology to voting, while I'm bringing the economic methodology to the realm of culture, how culture emerges and how it changes as a complex dynamic entity over time. So, today we will have the 11th such occasion of the Caravan of Knowledge, which will take place with your participation here. And we will cover the usual core of the talk. I'll go over the 10 founding principles of culture-based development, so the 10 main ideas. Then I'll give a little bit of flavor of the methodological aspects which are behind the implementation of culture-based development empirical work. And I will synthesize finally the value added. So, what is the thing that culture-based development indeed introduces as a new element of thought that causes this paradigmatic shift? And the talk will roughly be, we start with quite a delay, but roughly will go like this. I will go over the summary of the book for about 30 minutes. Then I'll spend about 15 minutes on the value added and the paradigm shift, and 15 minutes on the contribution of the paradigm to policymakers through something which is called aesthetic education. Again, quite an old idea, but put at a new level of implementation. So there is a shift also in how we can do aesthetic education policy making, thanks to the culture-based development paradigm and its contribution to science. And finally, We will have some time for questions and answers. I personally am very happy we started later. I can stay a few minutes later if there are questions to take them. Um, the book. The book is designed in the following manner. It has two big sections. The first section is main notions, and the second section is the application of these main notions about culture and the creation of cultural bias, and essentially the effects that culture creates. And the effects are divided into direct effects and indirect effects. Why we need all this first part separately? Because it takes essentially 5 chapters to put in order the handling of culture in economic terms. I introduce the definition of culture as such, which is not agreed in the field of economics as such. Okay. So I create this definition that is in agreement with other disciplines and that should be acceptable for economics as well, in a way that it will be comprehensive and will not omit important elements of culture. Because we all know that if we are about to model something, we should define it and identify it properly. If we have a problem with the identification, then the whole model will be problematic and biased. So this is the first chapter, defining culture. Because of being complex, culture has to be then handled in its complexity. So there is a notion of cultural distance, which also has to be introduced, and it manages to operationalize the part of the variation in culture which is between people. So the cultural distance between me and you, and how this is a basis for eventual taste for discrimination of a different size. Then there is within variation of culture as a complex entity, and this within variation is applying some complex theory principles, and in specific the use of Shannon entropy that divides the big complex thing culture into its two main components: cultural heritage and living culture. These are the two components of cultural capital, which is the main part of culture that affects economic choice. So the main notions here that you have introduced is culture, cultural capital, then how cultural capital's variation can be measured in terms of cultural distance, which is the between variation of culture, and cultural entropy, which is the within variation of culture, how culture is structured and restructured internally between the part which is inherited from the past, cultural heritage, and the part which is today invested in the different arts and performances that people either participate actively in as performers or that they participate as audiences. So once you have managed to structure your understanding for culture in terms of what entity it is, how this entity divides into culture, heritage, and living culture, specifically related to cultural production, and then how the difference between people's engagement with culture, heritage, and living culture creates the cultural distance between them, and also how this distance will vary over time if culture itself changes internally. How much you are from India, but if the culture of India today starts changing, right, then your self perception and how much you will be far away from other cultures will also start changing. So once you put precise definitions and precise measurements to these aspects of the complex entity culture, then you are ready to augment different models and see how culture causes bias on the standard rational choice in these cases. For instance, a direct effect would be an effect of the cultural milieu which a migrant considers before migrating, right? So, in the very option for choice, the cultural milieu is an element of the characteristics of the choice that the agent is making. And of course, people would go to a milieu that, in one or another way, is culturally more attractive. An example for an indirect effect would be, for instance, the desire to hire a good technician, IT technician, right? Now, you might be an unbiased person and you just want to hire the best technician for your job in order to do your functioning as a firm in the best possible way to maximize your profit. But unfortunately, if you are in a country that is having a ban on the entry of foreigners, among whom the best technicians in the world are found, then indirectly you simply cannot access certain resources because culturally they have been limited in terms of availability for you and your choice. So this is the difference between direct and indirect effects. And I am going over examples of two examples of direct and two examples of indirect effects, which relate to the extremes in cultural behavior. So you can have some degree of variability of the cultural structure. Culture, heritage, and living culture internally might be a little bit disbalanced. They can be balanced or they can be severely disbalanced. So if the internal composition of structure, the internal composition of culture has the structure of perfectly balanced importance and engagement with cultural heritage attitudes and living culture attitudes, then this means that the person is equally proud of their past and equally active in creating his own identity through learning and new experiences and creativity. Such kind of person is able to tap on one's knowledge of handling the world, heuristically known from culture from the past, but is also able and willing to adapt flexibly his appreciation of the world, um, depending on the survival needs of the moment. And this is a person whose cultural entropy is one, because mathematically, if you calculate the entropy between two classes, the maximum level, well, when the two classes are most balanced, is one. And culture entropy is associated with the classes of living culture and cultural heritage. Hence, when they're balanced, the entropy is one, it is the highest, and the person is essentially rational. They can take the rational decision without being too sticky to their heritage or to their love for fashion and novelty. If there is some kind of disbalance, if people are more prone to follow the heritage, or if they're more prone to trying being fashionable and innovative, then the balance between cultural heritage and living culture will be somewhere between 0 and 1. One of the entities will be disbalancing. And in both cases, no matter whether cultural heritage prevails or whether living culture prevails, you will always have some degree of bias on the rational choice. The person who is making the choice will be either avoiding novel ideas because he prefers old fashioned ones, or will be dropping old fashioned ideas even when they're good, just because he's striving to be modern. And then there are the ultimate cases, the extreme cases of the model, when either cultural heritage is entirely prevailing in the attitudes of people, or when the living culture is entirely prevailing in the attitudes of people. This means that the person is entirely rejecting the reality when it comes from a culturally disliked source for him. If a person is entirely proud of his past, he is every time rejecting everything new, no matter whether it is really bringing to progress and flourishing or not, and vice versa. One is disembracing everything just because of being entirely accepting only fashionable and new things. And in both cases, you have the maximum disbalance in the cultural entity between cultural heritage and living culture. This will correspond to cultural entropy, which is obviously zero, right? There is no diversity, there is no variation in it internally, and this will lead, I'm showing mathematically, to a collapse of the world, because if you deny all the time certain group of people their ideas, their contribution, which rationally by merit should be recognized, then ultimately they will cause what we know from standard economics to be the double Polanyian movement. But we know that people sometimes do Polanyian movement. This is what Polanyi contributed to science. But what culture-based development adds to it is when the double movement will appear, and it is when there is a complete disbalance in the cultural capital, when one of the entities, either cultural heritage or living culture, takes up entirely the attention and preferences of the local population, when their attitudes are entirely centered around only one type of cultural capital local. So this is the heavy lifting that I told you now about the content of the book. You can find it in a much more friendly way described in this story of culture-based development, CBD Robinson Crusoe. So there are many economists who have expressed their models through the use of the idealized model of Robinson Crusoe's behavior. And that's exactly what I'm doing here. It is about one chapter of a book-long description, which goes over what is culture, what is cultural capital, what is cultural distance, cultural entropy, and cultural bias. But it's doing it in this fairy tale kind of way, using Robinson Crusoe as an inspiration of the mnemonic story. It was written initially as the intended preface of the book, but then I decided for brevity and for academic concentration to keep the only mathematical and serious definitions in the book, and this more mnemonic teaching exercise of explaining what culture-based development can be found now on the website of culture-based development. You see it here, www.culturebaseddevelopment.com. In the section for the book, you can scroll down, find it, download it as a PDF file, and enjoy the story of Robinson Crusoe. So if we unpack the sections of the book, that's what you'll find. The main notions are the first 5 chapters, and then we have the direct and indirect effects of these 5 motions at play in the decision making of people. The final chapter is called Value-Free Analysis of Values, because while I want culture to be part of the modeling, I want it to be done in an evidence-based manner and not to allow for incorporating cultural bias of the researcher. That's why the chapter goes over the philosophical difference between integrating culture in a neutral, value-free manner, or allowing researchers' bias to seep in some kind of engagement of economists with moral issues. And in this sense, we can say that the first part of the book covers the culture-based aspect, explains what it means a choice to be culture-based, and then the second part of the book, the 6 to 10 chapter, go over the development part. So what is the development that this culturally based choice can look like in terms of direct cultural bias and indirect cultural bias in choice. And indeed, this is the content of the book. in a nutshell, each of these chapters can be considered a separate principle of how you have to approach culture. And the book itself is the economics of why culture emerges and why it has exactly the impact that it has, right? It's one thing to empirically identify that all culture matters, but the economic explanation, theoretical explanation of why you observe this is a different story. And different kind of scientists have praised this contribution to science and this shift in handling culture in economic modeling. Here you see one of the endorsements from David Aldrich from Indiana University, who has acknowledged the value added of the book in the manner that you see it stated there. Indeed, the culture-based development paradigm dares to go in fields of handling culture with economic methodology that were previously not addressed, that were previously not ventured by anyone. Now, how this venturing is gone? Well, when the emergence of culture is explained, I employ the standard model of the firm. So the person is seen as the firm price taker in a perfectly competitive market where he's trying to engage with society in order to achieve survival. So the survival is essentially the price, the loss of survival is the price on this market, and you have gains of survival reciprocal to this when the person accepts a particular level of valuing the oh, I cannot turn now, goes only in the one direction. um so the main idea of the previous slide was that I employ standard modeling such as the perfectly competitive market, or later on, once culture is defined, I show how the different cultural entropy leads to the choice of different strategies within game theoretical settings that can be applied for cases such as the migration choice, and whether the local population will act as a monopolist that rationally will agree with the entrance of small firms, small entries like further migrants entering in the labor market, or whether irrationally, due to its cultural disbalance, the monopolist, the local labor market, will be disturbed and oppositional to the entry of the firms. So this is the methodological aspect of how culture-based development translates the understanding of culture in the manner that the book lays it out into standard economic methodology. And the nutshell of the book is summarized in this variation of cultural entropy, which as a mathematical aspect uses Shannon entropy. Because the Shannon entropy is applied for two classes, it can vary between only 0 and 1. And then this is a very good index of the behavior of the model, the culturally augmented model. When the cultural entropy is close to 1, the choice is rational. When the cultural entropy is between 0 and 1, there is some degree of cultural bias. And when the cultural entropy approaches 0, then there is a Polanyian collapse of the system. And the Polanyian collapse of the system itself is shown again with Edgeworth's box. And it shows how the contract curve will disappear if the people end up in attaching an infinite cost to collaborating with a certain group of the local population. And then no point will be perceived by the people as a possible contract curve. And therefore, there will be a collapse of the system. Although technically possible cooperation will exist, people will not perceive it as existent for them. So I hope This gave you enough understanding how culture-based development handles culture as a complex dynamic entity and how in its core it is an evolutionary understanding of human behavior. But unlike most evolutionary behavioral economists who are looking at sexual attraction or some kind of motivations of this kind, culture-based development instead defines culture as the source for strategy of decreasing uncertainty from the environment. This is explained on the market for values, where I was telling you that, well, the uncertainty and of the survival is the price for survival. And then on this strategy can be used as an explanation for the choices that people will make. And all this is radically different from the way that culture was handled till now, both in classical economics and even in some behavioral fields, where they tried to take the role of the environment and the role of culture to some new levels, but they all stumbled over two main things, which culture-based development is the first to dare as territory. So there are two problems that couch-based development resolves that nobody else did before. And they are, so here I'm now in the field of our second part of the talk, the value added, and how this shift is created. The first problem that culture-based development resolves is the so-called turtle problem. Uh, I did allude to it, but let me synthesize it now. So most other approaches that were interested in culture, they say identity matters, institutions matter, there is taste for discrimination that matters, but they never say where does it come from. So, in philosophical and logical terms, this means that the causal chain is interrupted, and the thing which stands in the first place of the causal chain culture is not defined in terms of emergence. It is also problematic from the point of view of preferences, because also preferences are considered to be in the beginning of choice and are assumed to be obviously exogenous. But we all know that preferences of people are definitely not exogenous, starting with the example of the pork steak and extending it to any direction you wish. So culture-based development puts things in order by putting under the uh, queue of endless, infinite number of turtles stepping on the back of each other. Maybe you're familiar with the philosophical joke and the dilemma of not having causal identification. So it goes like this. There was a scientist who was giving a talk, and then he was explaining that there is a cause and effect, and the world has emerged in some rational ways. And then there was a believer in kind of irrational theories who told him, well, creationist for that matter, who told him, well, God has created the world. And the question from the scientist was, okay, what was the way that God created the world? And he said, well, there is an infinite, there is a turtle on the back of which the world is stepping. And the scientist asked him, what is the turtle standing on? And the creationist answered, well, an infinite row of turtles. And it's a little bit like this that culture is handled in the rest of economics till nowadays. Everybody knows that culture matters, but where it comes from, nobody knows. It stands on itself. While we know from practice that it does not stand on itself, that it stands from inherited cultures, and these cultures are modified in order to allow us to survive better. So that's how culture-based development resolves the turtle problem of not putting culture properly in the beginning of the causal chain, explained in terms of what part of culture is inherited and how the endogenous need for survival is factored on the market for values. This is the main contribution, the market for values, that culture-based development offers as a resolving mechanism of the turtle problem of culture. Then the second aspect that culture-based development resolves is very powerfully so and very well done in the 50 papers that I'm talking about, because the book is based essentially on 50 papers and more that have applied this rationale and that have tested it and that have shaped the basis for these principles which are presented in the book. Most of these papers are empirical. And this problem, the elephant problem, is the empirical way that culture has been handled in economics. Um, After economists realized that culture matters in the 90s, they started measuring culture in any kind of way imaginable. So, from the presence of coal mines to the opera theaters inherited from the past to the plow with which the ground was worked, any kind of proxy for culture. And they were even till nowadays trying to outbid themselves with the originality of the measure. But this creates a genuine cacophony because you cannot compare the results properly across the different uh, pieces of contribution, first of all. But what is the even worse problem is that if you quantify culture only with one small aspect of what it is, when people accepted the plow, or when whether there were nearby cultural opera houses or not in the past, then you are likely to do something that every quantitative economist is horrified by, and it is under quantifying a major entity that matters for choice. If you have an element of the function that matters, if you under quantify it when you try to make econometric analysis about the model, then you will cause under specification of the model due to under quantification of an important variable. So all these people who are finding out that something matters, in the end of the day, commit under quantification due to under specification. And not only me, but also Desmet, a very prominent professor that you most likely know very well as well, wrote a paper in 2017 which was echoing something that I wrote in 2014 already, that we don't know what we measure when we measure culture with monodimensional proxies such as only ethnicity or only some kind of trust attitude, because the map of the world that can be created when you use a separate proxy ends up being a very different map of the world, right? Which parts seem to be culturally identical looks very different because you under quantify the overall entity of what culture is. So essentially, the turtle problem is the problem of identification of culture, and the elephant problem is the problem of quantifying culture in its entirety. How culture-based development solves this? By creating this notion of cultural capital, which is a complex entity, and it is measured with multidimensional proxies, which are then reduced to cultural heritage and living culture components through the reduction methods, such as principal component factor analysis or Cumming clustering or any other relevant approach for reduction of data reduction method. So, culture-based development in this sense is a contribution which is innovative, causing a shift, but indeed it is very well positioned in the literature. You must know very well the work of Max Weber, who is renowned for his work of Protestant ethics and the spirit of capitalism, that suggests that different places achieve different levels of economic development because of the different religious and cultural attitudes that they harbor. Now, this famous book is about the difference between Calvinists and Catholics in Germany. But actually, his series of books that employ the same understanding that cultural attitudes determine the differences of regional development, includes works on China, works on India, and works on ancient Judaism. So he is always finding cultural differences locally and explaining how locally the different groups have a different socioeconomic flourishing because of the cultural differences that they have as groups. And culture-based development builds on this. In 2014, I wrote the paper "Was Weber Right?" and I correct him in the sense that to Weber, I introduced the solution of the elephant problem. He was approximating culture only with religion. But I'm saying this is monodimensional. We should see more full-fledged quantification of what is the cultural difference between groups in order to predict more precisely to what degree their economic, socioeconomic flourishing will really be different. Because culture is not only a religion. And then I told you that it's very important to have the dissemination of this approach, which is a shift, a paradigmatic shift in thinking. But in order to become a paradigmatic shift in practice of academics, it has to be endorsed by other academics. And also, it's very important that more people practice it because more evidence can be gathered about the relevance of this approach. And I have been trying to engage authors with that, going in the footsteps of Max Weber and revisiting his approach by substituting the quantification of culture, not with religion, but with a multidimensional measure of cultural heritage and living culture, which is the essence of the empirical improvement, the elephant problem solution of culture-based development. Uh, I have been doing this for the same geographies that his books are. So instead of looking how religion explains the differences between regions and their performance in Europe, I'm using the measures of cultural heritage and living culture and how they explain the regional differences in Germany and other Western countries. This was the first special issue published in the International Journal of Manpower with two volumes of the special issue, so about 12 papers, different scientists from different places, and for Germany, and for the Netherlands, and for the United States, that adopted the culture-based development approach and showed how differences within the regions of their countries or differences between the regions of different countries, which is respectively the introversive and extroversive approach of applying culture-based development, can be demonstrated in consistence with the expectations of Max Weber. Then I had a second special issue dedicated to his second book, which was the Neo-Weberian approaches in the regions of China. Again, unlike Weber, who was comparing the Chinese population in terms of different religions, I used the cultural heritage and living culture measures to estimate the difference between the population in the regions of China, and I estimate how this matters for the socioeconomic flourishing in the regions of China and China compared to the rest of the world. Of course, not only me, this is the special issue here, but also the special issue with participation again of two volumes of people, about 12 papers, 12 different scientists, main authors, and much more co-authors. And now we have a special issue dedicated to India. Which I would like to invite all of you who are curious about it to participate in. It is placed in Region, the official journal of the Regional Science Association. In parallel, there is also a second one dedicated um, to the world of the Semitic cultures, but of course, the most important here is about India. And just a few words about the aesthetic education. I don't know how we are going in time. Maybe I took a little bit more than I intended. So the aesthetic education is entailed uh, generally in the idea that people should be given opportunity to engage with the arts. And this exists within every culture since humans existed, right? Music is one of the first things that we developed. There are many benefits of aesthetic education for the development of the mind. But where does culture-based development improve the aesthetic education policy making? It divides the curriculum of the cultural engagement into engagement with things inherited from the past and things currently created. So, cultural heritage and living culture, cultural participation experiences. If the mind is exposed to the opportunity to engage with heritage as often as with modern living culture, then you are wiring the brain in a healthy manner that it values what it inherits and what it currently creates creatively equally. So then you create a rational mind. And the more you outweigh either of the forms, the more biased human you create. This is the main take for how to monitor and how to balance the curriculum, so to speak, of the aesthetic education in places in order to create healthy minds. The way that we are caring to create healthy bodies and we want the children that go to school, right, to be fed properly, the same way we want to create healthy minds. What people will do with their healthy minds and healthy bodies afterwards, hopefully, will be something for the good of everyone as long as they are rational and well balanced individuals. So, this is the thing that I wanted to share with you. Thanks to KREA. And remember that if you want to try your hand, you're welcome to. You can find the call for the special issue on India, culture-based development in the regions of India, through this QR code. And if you want to write such a paper, I will be happy also to give you guidelines how to succeed in making a successful publication. This is all I wanted to say. Now, on the website of culture-based development, you can find both the call and also a link to the previous special issues so that you can get oriented how they looked like as contributions. So now, any questions are more than welcome. Hope you heard me what I said. I'm not entirely sure how was the audio.
Thank you so much. You have covered so many things with respect to culture, culture capital, culture distance, culture entropy, so on and so forth, and linking with what is that, like China, covering China and coming to India. So let's see if anyone have any questions. So meanwhile, can you throw some light on like how culture is important in terms of development? Development. Like anyway, you covered what is called culture.
Okay, so there are different ways that you can capture the presence of culture and cultural endowment of places. And you can see how the exposure of the local population to the aesthetic education of particular balance between culture, heritage, and living culture is associated to the local productivity. You can this is one type of development. You can see whether people exposed to cultural heritage more often, right, reject, for instance, the innovative patents more often, and how places that are more balanced in the um, way that their minds are wired between valuing cultural heritage and valuing living culture tend to give way to new ideas and innovation more often. Okay, this is the expectation that culture-based development has, and this is the development that has been indeed found in the empirical studies. So if you have a look at the paper, which is cultural entropy, innovation and growth, right? It's one of the papers of culture-based development from 2025. You can see how the wiring of the brains of people throughout the regions of Europe with culture, heritage, and living culture predicts how often they indeed make innovation, how often they have patents. And as we all know, the innovation is the source of economic growth, as also Ahion and all latest Nobel laureates have predicted. But culture-based development explains what is the source of this different propensity to accept innovation. After you control for the investment, of course, in innovation, still the way that culture has wired the brains of people has an important effect on whether the locality, with the investment that it has made in innovation, will be able to generate innovation or not. Just because people will be more prone to accept new ideas when they're wired in a more balanced way, and they will be more rejectful to things which are uncertain and new for them when they're wired in a more sticky traditional value system. And it is a value free analysis of values, because it doesn't really matter what kind of culture you're sticking, as long as you're sticking to the old, being afraid of the new. Whatever your old is, you will always have this effect. It might be a very beautiful old practice, right? But it was beautiful when it was created, and when people, if it is unable to innovate and to adapt, it becomes for the modern person a kind of a sticky source of updating what is rationally useful at the moment. Okay.
Okay.
And
I
it
think,
doesn't mean that a person has to completely deny one's past, because then one gets swayed into always escaping uh, the advice from the past, even when it is good, right? So you have to be in balance to be able to appreciate both perspectives according to what is necessary for survival current.
yeah, thank you, ma'am. Now you can see chart. There are two questions.
Yes, there is a very nice long thing. Let me read it. Thank you for the wonderful presentation. My question relates to the aspect you mentioned in your talk about how in economics proxies are used for measuring of culture. If we take the example of Singh's work on political culture and subnationalism, she uses concepts like acculturation, assimilation, and discrimination between different ethnic groups to study the politics of a nation. So, is it not necessary to narrow down culture to such proxies to operationalize and quantify? Thank you for the question. Very important question, and also very much close to the heart of culture-based development. There are many papers of culture-based development that is looking at political behavior and political voting, and polarization in political voting. And especially in these cases, one should be able to identify culture separately and do not confuse it with proxies which might be too close to the political mindset and process itself. You have to know what part of the behavior comes from culture, what part of the behavior comes from the political agency, what part of the behavior, voting behavior, comes from the economic incentives for people to vote in one or another way. So we know that people who are not financially prosperous in a particular period, they will be motivated to vote against the party, whichever party is in charge, right? So this is the economic source. And this will interfere in terms of how people will start to value things also morally. So this is the endogeneity of culture. So you have to know how the endogenous part and the sticky cultural heritage part are balanced locally in order to be able to predict when the local culture will allow people to polarize significantly, and the discrimination and the ultra right behavior to be really prominent, and when the local milieu will be more balanced, and in spite of the economic challenge, people will manage to find a way to decrease each other's uncertainty and avoid polarizing against each other, and avoid going in political extremes and turning down the local voting. You see what I mean? So everything is possible. The question is how together we create for each other a cultural milieu which interacts also with the economic reality in order to affect our political choices. And it's really, really important to be able to sort out and identify these three things separately. Otherwise, you are able to, well, we are likely to go into a kind of biased prediction whether there will be a political turmoil or not. In terms of discrimination, discrimination is not a proxy. Discrimination is a result of cultural attitudes of hate or love. Okay, so if certain place is more disbalanced culturally, if it is sticking more to its past, then local identities which are not associated with the same past will be more discriminated. And then the same place, if it manages to rewire the brains of the local population, which is dominant, right, as a presence, as physical presence, then these same people may not discriminate the others. An example for this is Germany, right? In some periods of German history, Germany Nazified, right? And the local population was very intolerant and discriminatory, even killed population, right? But then in other periods, they managed to rewire their brains so that now in the modern waves of migration, Germany was one of the places which was welcoming migrants from the Arab world in a certain period when other countries of Europe were disrupted and opposing it. So the the level of discrimination has to be properly defined and properly measured where it comes from, because if you oversimplify it and if you say, oh, Germans are always, you know, very rigid, well, then part of reality will agree with you and the other part of reality will be exactly the opposite of what you're expecting and you're predicting. And you have to understand when and why, because supposedly nobody wants to live in a dramatic war situation. So it is better for all that we avoid the, in some way or another, the conflict situations. However, when things are disrupted and socioeconomic inequalities appear, this creates endogenous incentives for people to start sticking more and more to culture, and this exacerbates the opposition between cultures because culture is our source of decreasing uncertainty. We belong to certain culture because this tells us how to be good and how the world will be okay even when there is economic instability, right? And when the economic instability increases, we start holding faster and stronger to this cultural prediction intuitively, in a bounded way, that we are afraid for our survival and we just try to secure it somehow. When the economic tool is getting broken, we cling more to the cultural because we have to cling to something in order not to sink. I hope this answer manages to cover what you were expecting. If you want, you can ask me further. If
Like, answer my question in great detail. Thank you very much.
Yeah, so any questions? There is one more question. So how did you use culture entropy to model bias?
Yeah.
Which is
This is the essence of what culture-based development manages to do. So bias means a deviation from something, right? From the rational choice in this case. You know what is the rational choice to be made? The rational choice of the Homo economicus is supposed to be a kind of optimizing solution. When the person who is not cognitively biased, who knows what is the optimal solution, does a choice which is not optimal, then there is a bias. And the question that culture-based development answers is how this deviation from the rational choice is predicted by the cultural wiring of the brain. And the cultural wiring of the brain is then very carefully quantified in terms of all the aspects of cultural heritage and all the aspects of living culture, taken into consideration how your religion, how your presence of temples, how your presence of operas, all the different proxies taken together and reduced to culture, heritage, and living culture in a precise data reduction method can predict the wiring of your brain, whether you value more the past or whether you value more the currently created parts of your identity. Then you can know precisely how big the deviation from rational choice will be due to the cultural component in your choice. You may do a deviation from the rational choice also because you're cognitively, I'm sorry to say it, but you're naive, as the behavioral economists say, or because you're stupid, and you will be able to see what part of the deviation from rational choice comes from the cultural variation and what part of the deviation remains unexplained, which then potentially could be found in cognitive bias or any other kind of aspects that create deviation from rational choice. And
Thank
this
you.
indeed is the essence of culture-based development. And the good news is that when you capture the source of culture, uh, as culture is a source of the cultural bias, if you know how culture emerges, you can decrease this and you can make the choice more rational. You cannot make people more clever, but you can definitely make them less culturally biased to each other, and this will help them to cooperate better and be more innovative, productive, and so on. Less conflictual, less discriminating to each other, and all that we mentioned. If you have ideas how to contribute as researchers to the special issue, I can also answer that. Or any
Hello,
other.
ma'am.
Hello.
Hello, I'm JD Prabhakar from Geetha University. I must be thankful to you for that wonderful, insightful lecture. Um since you studied the culture and the development in depth, are there any instances where you studied about the medium of instruction with specific to the culture? Because I believe culture flows through the language. So, is there any link, medium of instruction, and that I'm when you just opened the journal for Indian issue? Uh, so I'm very much interested to contribute that in this language aspect because I'm from linguistics background. So I just want to take your input on that.
Well, thank you very much for the lovely question. In the book, you will find a very detailed discussion about the three ways that culture can be measured. And one of the measures for culture is indeed language and the frequency of words. As you very well know from linguistic perspective, the more frequent words will be the ones that take the mind of the people most of the time. And then obviously
Yeah.
with this you can quantify culture. Then, and the quality of culture locally, whether the words are coming from the past, whether they're new ones. There is study that is showing that the adoption of new words related to tea, to the word tea, right,
Yeah.
were predicting they were predicting the inflows of import from China, and they
Wow.
have a
That's
memory till nowadays. Places that linguistically adopted these words first in their linguistic corpus, they keep having more trade with China. And then you have two other ways to measure culture. One is self-reported attitudes. Obviously, then you come closest to what people really think. And then you have cultural participation. So going to activities which are cultural and then either related to heritage or to living culture. And these three measures are not occurring accidentally. As you pointed very well, these are the different ways through which culture is transmitted, the different ways to which
yes.
it is imprinted in the mind of people and leaves a footprint of being
Yes.
part of reality. So language is a major channel for the acceptance of culture. And then the self-reporting of attitudes and what is being told. Well, that's how our cultural and moral education, it's again linguistically transmitted, but
Yes.
the one is outside of us, perhaps, in terms of the institutionalized use of language. And the personal communication part of language. And then the third part, the participation in the arts, is an indirect observed behavior, which, however, is again organized through the medium of different forms of languages of expression and communication between people. And the reason for this is that culture is relational. So there is some
Yeah.
kind of communication which is, um, by definition, necessary in order to be able to talk about culture. Otherwise, a person is just a person. You need at least two
Ex-
people to establish a culture that is meaningful code of conduct between them, what is good and what is bad, and how we decrease our mutual threat to each other by agreeing to be good in particular way, which decreases the uncertainty of how we'll behave to each other, right? So this is one part of the story, why culture is definitely related to language. Then, of course, there is aspect of this presence of language in our life, which is the linguistic discrimination. And here on the chat, we have Baluza Shaimakhanova, who is one of my PhD students with whom we looked at the linguistic discrimination of Welsh-speaking students in comparison to English-speaking students, okay? So this is just one of the many cases when cultural distances might be a source for discrimination, cultural discrimination, right? And
Yes.
they might be politically sensitive in places. Here, definitely in Wales, they are. Clearly, there are many cases in linguistically rich countries like India where this will be a sensitive issue. The loss of certain languages, of course, the revival of languages. Is it possible to revive a language? Is it possible then to count this in a proper way, that because the level of knowledge of the language would be very different. So there are mothers here who are speaking very minimal level of language, and then their children being engaged in educational system have completely different level of the knowledge of Welsh. So if you make just a counting of how many people speak it, speak can be a very different notion, and then of course it will play very deeply in the differences in their behavior, what it means indeed. Then there is a very important third aspect of language that culture-based development has also looked at. It is the role of language as a means for creating the thinking mind. So in other words, the large language models that are trying to use linguistic information in order to mimic human behavior. So this is this relationship between language and culture is the main topic of the next book of culture-based development, for which I have now a contract and which is expected to come in 2027. Language is exclusively important for understanding how people beget their culture and how it becomes imprinted in them in terms of what they're exposed to as an environment. It may continue in many directions that I haven't explored, but the structure of the language itself is also related. This comes mostly from quantitative linguistics, but it's relevant and could be explored. How places that are more often using the I are more
Mm.
individualistic countries, and then countries that are more using plural forms are more having a culture which is more inclusive and communal. There is a very big progress again coming from Harvard. You might have heard about the Upswing. It is a book by Robert Putnam, who is a pioneer in social capital. Now, cultural capital and social capital in sociology are two very different entities, but they're related. Social capital is how much people are prone to cooperate, and cultural capital is how people identify themselves according to the culture that they emerge from. So, the point is that cultural capital defines whether you have social capital with someone or not. But Putnam studies from the point on when you have different level of social capital, how you behave differently. Now, in this study of his, he used language. In his most recent book, he used language, and he found that the ratio between the word I and the word we changes over time. This is very much consistent with culture-based development idea that the structure of culture varies over time, and I can be thought of as the inherited identity and we as the more inclusive current cultural attitude to whoever is around you. So cultural entropy measures this I-we balance. Instead of using cultural entropy, he is using just the ratio between the words I and we. And he shows how the change of this ratio is associated to conflict, war, and socioeconomic downturns and upswings. Okay, in the case of the states. So there is a lot of promise in looking into language as a source of encoding culture in the mind of people, and then using language as the measure for how the cultural wiring of the brain has been set in different places. So thank you for this question.
Thank you so much for that answer. Detailed.
If you have any ideas about the study of language throughout the territory of throughout the regions of India, this will be exclusively interesting contribution for the special issue that we have in region. So reach out, send your paper, and then we will see how it can be developed. Thank
Definitely. Yeah, in fact, my PhD is in that area. So I worked on socio-economic profiling of Indian languages. I recently published that book. I really looking forward to collaborate with you for this journal.
Me too. I'm interested in India beyond just the special issue, so let's keep in touch. My email, I'll put it in the chat, and Suresh
Yeah.
has it. He can give it to everybody. I'll give you
Yeah.
my work email,
Yes.
which is a.k.tubaji@swansea@ac.uk, or my personal email, which is a.tubaji@hotmail.com. So you and any other participant that is interested in reaching out, you're more than welcome. Really looking forward. And I really hope you will contribute. I'm looking forward to see what you have done. Also, you said you have published a book.
Yes, ma'am. Yes.
That will be super interesting too. We plan also to make some book reviews. So this may be very relevant. So we may be reviewing your book. If you can share with...
I will share with them. Yeah. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much everyone. And thank you so much for you also, ma'am, for spending almost more than 1.5 hours. Okay.
Okay, then thanks everyone and bye-bye.